Hello everybody and welcome to another video of CS301. Today we will continue talking about intellectual property. In the last video I showed you different court cases and how different copyright laws and acts came to be. Today we're going to pretty much pick up from there and talk about a few different things, such as the different open source licenses that are out there, along with some of the modern challenges to the business model and copyright that have appeared in the last few years. So first, let me remind you about Safe Harbor and what that is. So Safe Harbor is the concept that as long as an industry that issues a takedown notice, so if somebody, a copyright holder, which typically being a big company, they own let's say the copyright to a music video, and they see that video being hosted somewhere, as long as they can issue a takedown notice per the DMCA being the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, as long as they are able to do that and the website complies with that notice, then the website itself is not in violation, and only the person that uploaded the video did. So in this case, for websites like YouTube, or back in the day MySpace, or Facebook in this case nowadays, any of those websites that may be hosting videos that may be copyrighted, or music or other copyrighted items, as long as the copyright holder can send a takedown notice and they follow through and actually take down the copyrighted infringed material, then the website is okay because they are not responsible for it. If they don't comply though, if the website does not actually comply with the takedowns, then now they're in violation essentially. Some of the takedown notices may actually violate fair use, which we also talked about what fair use was last video, and some of those have been issued a takedown notice. This happens a lot in YouTube, that certain clips and things of small portions of video being used for educational purposes or other nonprofit reasons that would fall under fair use get issued a takedown notice by the YouTube's automated copyright system, which technically speaking is not a copyright violation. But when you get a takedown notice from YouTube, it's more of like guilty until proven innocent in the way the system is set up. So it's not quite perfect, but YouTube is forced to take this stance to avoid being complicit and in violation of the DMCA and other copyright laws. They have to comply with that. That's how they can achieve their safe harbor. Okay, so hopefully that's a little bit of a refresher on the safe harbor. And so with that said, let's kind of talk about some of the evolving business models and things that are kind of happening nowadays with some recent developments in computing that kind of sort of push this safe harbor concept to the limit. So for example, let's talk about cloud storage. So that's pretty recent development, is the idea of cloud storage. While it has been more popular in the industry for a couple of years now, it's more recent that it's coming to to regular consumers and to the non-tech people. And that's of course thanks to things like Apple and Google having their cloud storages offered. So let's talk about something that you purchased legally. So let's say you purchased some music legally and you're holding that music in your computer. Is it a violation of copyright law to copy from your personal computer, your laptop, your tablet, whatever it is? If you're copying that information into the cloud, is that a violation of copyright? Because now you're sharing a copyrighted file. And then does the company, Apple or Google or whoever, Dropbox or MyCloud or any of those services, are they responsible? Do they have any sort of responsibility for holding content that it might be a violation of copyright that their customers? And here's the thing, they might actually be using the cloud service to share to other people. So like, let's say I upload a file to my Google Drive or my Gmail account, and then I send it to 2 other people, and it's a copyrighted file of maybe like an academic paper. So now they're getting that paper as well, from the cloud. The cloud is using it to redistribute. So who is responsible of what here? And does Apple have a responsibility, or does Google have a responsibility to monitor what is in that cloud server for potential copyright material, similar to how YouTube does? Of course, I don't think I have to point out that for them to do that, they would have to be able to access your files and search through them, which may be seen as an invasion of privacy, right? So for them to be able to audit those files and make sure that there is no violations like they would with YouTube's automated copyright detection, they'd have to pretty much be looking at your videos, and that, of course, again, is a privacy violation, right? So typically, the cloud owners, the Google and Apple, don't go scanning through your files because they don't want to get the bad press for the privacy invasion. But then, because the copyright holders do not see what is stored, they don't really have the option to send takedown notices. When the industry sends that takedown notice, to be able for them to send it, they need to know that something is in violation, but they can't know if Google doesn't look into the user's files. And so this whole thing is quite a bit of a mess, because on one side, we could help the copyright owners by decreasing privacy and being able to monitor what's in the cloud, but that of course negatively affects the individual users who are using the cloud with the expectation of privacy. But then again, they're violating the law. So do they get away with it because of the privacy or not? So no good answer for that, but that is definitely one of the more evolving models and things that may in near future potentially change things, if they pass laws against this stuff with cloud computing. So going back, since I mentioned that they have the files on iTunes and things like that, nowadays, even though we talked about Napster and all the legal repercussions of that, websites like the new Napster or iTunes do allow you to obtain music for very cheap prices, $1 per song or whatever, and generate good revenue. So even though Napster was first kind of a bad thing, now it has, kind of turned the music industry into a digital world, back from like CDs and tapes. On the other hand, YouTube, that I was talking about with takedown notices, one of the things that, I got to see that, I guess in my lifetime, how YouTube went from no copyright detection, really, very little, to pretty much getting really aggressive with copyright, but then convincing all the copyright holders, and by those I mean the big industry companies, the music holders, like I can think of Universal Music Group as one of them for some reason, UMC I think it's called, but so they convinced them to allow their music to be hosted. But what happens is, instead of having a takedown notice sent, what they do is they take over the ad revenue from your video if you have it enabled. And if you don't have it enabled in your video, then all they do is enable it for you and take any ad revenue by putting ads and other things so they can profit from you using the content. And I suppose this is technically a win-win scenario, because you get to use those cool musics in your custom videos while the copyright owner is happy and you're not violating any law, because they're technically making money from the ad revenue. Of course, technically speaking, this is if in reality you were otherwise copyright infringing. But if you were using it under a fair use, then now all of a sudden they're getting revenue from something that came from fair use, which is wrong. So there are weaknesses, pros and cons to content sharing websites that allow posting of content in exchange of a shared ad revenue with the content owners in compensation. So, yes. Another thing I would like to point out is that a lot of these companies, can't be bothered, especially the smaller ones, with being able to track all of these different copyright infringements, like people posting videos on YouTube and whatnot. So they typically will hire another company, or they created a company which kind of just became its own thing, kind of like the Copyright Clearance Center, so that they just go ahead and say, okay, look, we own all these songs, and what we're gonna do is we don't have the resources or the technical expertise to be able to hunt all these people that are uploading our music on the internet, and so they say, hey, okay, you go after them, get us some ad revenue at least, or some royalty fees from whatever you get that you catch with these people, and we'll share some of it with you. And so that's a brand new industry that kind of appeared out of nowhere. So those are some examples of some evolving business models. There are others, of course. I mean, this is of course a happy ending in terms of YouTube, because it allows you to share all these musics and make your own creative work using copyrighted material. And again, technically everybody wins, because you can use music that you'd otherwise have to license. So if I wanted to use a song in this video, and it was a real song, like from like somebody actually made it, an artist and skilled and whatnot, I'd have to go find them, contact them, hope that they actually are okay with it, and then pay them probably a lot of money. Now with this YouTube stuff, some songs they don't allow, like flat out do not allow. Like for example, I think Beatles music they don't allow, but like a lot of music they will allow. I'm one of my videos, like in short films that I did, I think I used like one song from the Rolling Stones, and it was like the background music for that. I mean, imagine how am I gonna, first of all, I have to figure out who to contact, who the music is licensed to, contact them, come up with an agreement and a deal of distribution and whatnot. They might just say no. They might be like, nah, we're not gonna license this Rolling Stone song to you, even if you pay us money. They might say yes, but they still might charge me a lot of money. And I have to go through all those venues, which kind of hinder my creativity. Or I can just upload it on YouTube and they notice it. They just take ad revenue. They maybe make $1 from my video. But hey, I got to show my video to the world, which is probably what I wanted in the first place. And I didn't care about ad revenue. I just wanted to show it. Plus, it would be technically unethical to make ad revenue with copyright infringement stuff. So if I was uploading somebody else's music and making profit from that, that's even worse. So definitely, it's an evolving world, because if you would have told me that this was going to happen 15 years ago, I would have been like, no, there's no way that all these big companies, like massive billion-dollar companies, are going to be okay with random person from middle of nowhere using a high-profile song in a independent video for free, essentially, other than taking some ad revenue. Like, what's an ad revenue? So it's actually really, really cool at the end of the day. Yes, YouTube is not perfect, but definitely the fact that they've achieved something like that, like pressuring all these copyright holders, is amazing. Now, that's a success story, but not all of them are. Here's some examples of things that are not quite ideal and didn't really work out because, well, it makes sense now, but I guess at the time everything was chaos and nobody knew what was happening. And one of those is this company. It was a startup company, and it started back in 2011, and they had an idea. This was back in the day of like 2011. It was definitely not. I think it was past when Blockbuster died. That was around the time that the red boxes were coming up, and all these. It was an era of DVDs, first of all. So that was around DVD era. Maybe starting to get into Blu-ray era. And so, but the technology for copying DVDs was very cheap at then. And so they went ahead and said, why don't we go buy a bunch of DVDs, copy them, and then actually, I think what they did is they bought the DVDs and then they rented the content. So, but the content, the way they rented it, I think it was online, if I remember. Let me refresh. I think that they bought the DVDs and they said, hey, we own the DVD now, so we're going to go ahead and allow you to online to rent the content. I think that was what they did. Or they were making copies of the DVD and renting those and claiming that, well, they had a copy of the DVD, so therefore it is legal. I think that's what they were doing. It's been a while, but that of course now makes obvious sense that it's not quite right. But at the time, we weren't quite sure if that would be okay. Plus, they could imagine they did this. I'm not sure if this is what they did, but like they say they bought 3 DVDs, okay, and they allowed 3 people to rent it online, but only 3 people at a time. So what they're doing is they're basically saving on shipping and things like that. Kind of like the start of Netflix, if you think about it, how Netflix works now. You know, they allow people to stream these movies that they pay for. But this was kind of like a pre-Netflix era where they were kind of having the same idea, like, okay, instead of mailing out the DVDs, can we just offer them online? And we'll only let like 3 people watch it at a time because we only have 3 DVDs. We're just not physically sending them the DVD. I think that's what they were doing. And it turned out that the court said, like, no, you can't do that. That's a copyright violation, so they shut them down. Other things that kind of don't really work are things like Pirate Bay. Because, yes, Pirate Bay can be used for legal reasons, but most of the time it's not really used for legal reasons because people are sharing copyright material. So the concept of peer-to-peer is great and amazing, and torrents are a cool, like, technological advancement to be able to download things really fast and share things with the world for good reasons, but typically seems to be going to negative reasons, and especially websites like Pirate Bay and other torrent search engines, which I think is what that is considered to be. Talking about search engines, actually, that's another issue with copyright, because when you search for something, you know, we go on Google, and nowadays you can go to Google Images and you can Google search, right? And so when you search for Google Images, you know, you type in a keyword. Let's say you type in car, or actually maybe let's say that's not really copyrighted. Let's say you instead search for Star Wars as your search term or query. And so you get a bunch of images from potentially Star Wars. Some of these may be copyrighted, but yet Google is showing them to you on Google's website. Why do they do that? Well, they kind of have to, because it allows you to properly search. It's kind of hard to search for images if you can't see the results of the search. They claim that this would fall, these thumbnails essentially, creating them and displaying them would fall under fair use. And pretty much that's, nobody has really fought that as far as I'm aware. And so at least fought and won, but they're okay with saying that those are fair use. Right? And the other side of the coin is that even if they didn't show you these images, let's say that, that they didn't show them and they just gave you links. For them to be able to match something with your results, they have to store it locally in their servers, right? And then, of course, if they are showing you thumbnails, they have to store them locally as well. That's known as caching. So if you take in 219 and you know about cache, then this all makes sense. Otherwise, you'll talk about cache. But idea of cache in this scenario is that rather than trying to go and look in the entire internet for images that match, they keep a copy of the images in the Google servers so they can more quickly search through that data set than trying to download the entire internet. You know, every time somebody searches something and pretty much fail at trying to do something fast. So, you know, this has expanded nowadays. I don't remember what it's called. I guess I'll just grab my phone and see. But when you go on Google something on the mobile device and you click on the link, what you get is Google's, I think this is it, it's Google's AMP. Google will cache an entire website and then show you the cached version with the alleged reason that it's supposed to save you some data. Of course, this might potentially mess with the website owner's ad system and can create some issues. So in the past, they've negotiated with certain of the big websites to make sure that they have the correct licenses for this. But there's always some that are not too happy with doing this. Sorry, I have to take some water. On the other hand, if you go to Google News, if you search for an item in Google for under the news category, you typically will get some headlines and potentially some images as well, excerpts and other things. Same thing. But in those, it could be said that most people might just read the headlines of news. So by going on Google and seeing all the headlines, they might actually not go into the website where before they would. So this has been kind of an iffy one. So they definitely had to have agreements with the different providers of news to allow that to happen and to make sure that they are linking to the news and things like that. Similarly, as trivial as it sounds, if you're searching in Google something that is technically trademark, like what would be a good trademark? I can't really think of any trademarks right now. I guess I'm not too brainwashed with it. I'm loving it. Yeah, that's the McDonald's one, right? I'm loving it. So that's a trademark phrase. Technically speaking, Google can't display that. Technically speaking, Google can't really display that because that would be trademark violation. But if you search for that, it's displaying it. So the reason they get around that is because they, again, are going on the fair use. Plus, it's probably that they're Googling for McDonald's when they Google that. So it's in the benefit of apparently it's a Justin Timberlake song too. But I'm sorry, interesting. So I don't know if it's officially a McDonald's thing, but okay. But yeah, so whatever the trademark is, just do it. Isn't that Nike's, right? No, it's also that meme video. But yeah, so these are trademarks, but at the end of the day, the trademark holder will probably be okay as long as you're actually linking back to them, because it benefits them because you're trying to access them, right? If Googling just do it takes you to the Nike website, I don't think that they would be very not happy with you linking to that. So yes, I can't really. It's so sad I can't think of a proper trademark. Trademark like phrase for some reason. Leave your favorite trademark phrase in the comments, guys. Maybe I'll know some of them. I just can't think of any right now because I think Just Do It is actually just a meme, but it might also be a Nike thing. I don't know. So okay, but anyways, other interesting things to talk about that have kind of helped the world is the digitizing of a lot of the content that's in public domain. So we talked about public domain last time, just a refresher of that. A copyright holder typically holds copyright on something for a limited amount of time. That limited amount of time is typically beyond their lifetime usually. As I said before, we searched it, it was something like 75 years or 90 years. It really depends on the content, but I think that's post-mortem, that time extra. So typically people don't have to worry about their copyright, more of like their grandchildren that have to kind of worry about still retaining copyright for things like that. But for things that eventually do get to the public domain, which of course are, pretty much anything older than, for sure, like I would say 100 years, but maybe 120 years. I don't know, like I'm trying to think of, like, for example, Mickey Mouse and when that was created, because that's still copyrighted today. But essentially, things will eventually get to the public domain. And that'll be an interesting day when things that are like modern Hollywood movies actually get to the public domain and people can go ahead and like re-edit them and publish them actually. So interesting things will happen 100 years from now, assuming they don't keep updating the copyright law to add more years. But yeah, for things that are in the public domain, now that we have computers, a lot of people have dedicated their time to digitizing all of this public domain content. One major example of that, which I recommend you check out, is Project Gutenberg. Project Gutenberg digitizes books that are in public domain. Other people that digitize books, Microsoft has another group that scanned millions of public domain books in the University of California's library. Google themselves has also, Google themselves has also scanned another millions of books that are in the public domain, but also some that are not. And so they kind of went a little bit ahead of these two. But what they do is, for the ones that are in the public domain, they show the full thing. But for the ones that are still copyrighted, they only display excerpts. And I have an interesting story about that actually. Because the way those excerpts work is they're only supposed to show certain pages that are, I think, either randomly picked if they don't know the copyright holder, or if they do and they contact them, then they're supposed to decide how much of the book they want to show on what parts. So my story goes that one of the faculty members at UNLV wrote an amazing book that is actually currently being used to teach classes. And he did a great job with the book. And he wanted to allow, one of the things that the publisher asked him was, would you like to make your book available to be searchable on Google using this sort of excerpt system? And he said, well, okay, how much of the book is supposed to be shown? And they gave him a number which I can't remember, but let's just say it was 10% of the book. And so when pressed, the publisher said that it was supposed to be a random 10% of the book, to which he agreed, and that was fine. Well, it turned out that the way that they decided to do that is anybody who was searching for the book could see 10% indeed, but they could see the first 10% they were looking at. So like if they started reading from the beginning of the book, they would get 10% of the book read in. And again, I think it was actually more than 10%. I think it was like 25%, but let's just say it's 10%. They could look at the first 10% of the book. They could also look at like a piece here, a piece here, a piece here, anywhere they wanted in the book really. But when they reached their quota, the rest of the book would say, excerpt not available, right? This seemed right at first look, but it turned out that it allowed anybody to look at any 10%. So it was very easy for me to say, log into Google or just simply enter Google in some IP location, look at the first 10%, then go somewhere else and look at the second 10%, look at from 10 to 20%, and then do the same thing from somewhere else. Or I could just use something known as a VPN, which allows me to spoof my location by using an intermediary server. And very easily, as long as I had at least enough connections to get to 100%, very easily I could get 100% of the book to see. And of course, that is not what the publisher said. So there was a bit of an agreement there. And I think that either Google fixed it or the publisher, it was probably publisher's fault. I highly doubt that this was a Google thing, but it might have been. But they fixed it. I think they either fixed it or they just completely took down the book. They said to Google, nope, do not show any excerpt of the book. Do not make it searchable. The end. Or if you make it searchable, just tell them the name of the book. That's the other part. If you want to search, let's say that somebody's searching for the topic of this book and they search one of the subtopics of the book. So one of the things that they learn in the class. It will be beneficial, and this is the whole reason that they're doing this, for the book to show up in the search results like, hey, there's this book about this stuff and it has like an exact match to the words that you're looking for. So you might want to take a look at this book. That's what they want, and that's why the excerpts are shown, because then you can see a little bit of context as to where this search query came in, so that the person that is searching can confirm that this is indeed something that is relevant to them. But for Google to be able to do this, they need to keep a copy of the entire book in their servers, which could be considered copyright violation. But as we said, we've kind of sort of given that okay to search engines because it benefits us, and also because it frankly does indeed happen to fall to fair use, to our point of view. And so I believe that in this case, what they said was, okay, yes, you can make the book searchable, but if they find it a match, they just tell them that this is this book and don't give them any excerpts or things like that. So there are some flaws with this system. I saw one pretty much in person, but it's still definitely something that is very, very cool that they can do this. I myself did my PhD dissertation in OCR, post-processing. OCR stands for optical character recognition, and that's the process of taking a picture of a book, which would be like a scanned document, and converting it into actual digital text that you can read and search through in a computer, which is exactly what Google is doing. And I don't know if Microsoft and Gutenberg, but I'm assuming they do too, because you can download text files. Yeah, you can download text files from Gutenberg. So yeah, they are all probably running OCR. So OCR is a big thing. It's old, but it's still being developed because it has not been perfected yet, which is why I did my dissertation on that. I use machine learning and other post-processing techniques, ad hoc and whatnot. But it's a big topic. because there's a lot of stuff that is not been digitalized yet. UNLV had ISRI, which is $1 million institute back in, I think, the 90s, before they stopped it, where one of the big things that they were doing was Yucca Mountain, and they had a bunch of legal documents that they wanted to scan and make searchable. They didn't really care about digitalizing them completely. They just wanted to be successful at being searchable. And they did like actual research at UNLV and proved that the OCR was accurate enough to be able to search for what you wanted without missing out on any relevant documents, I think. Even though with OCR, you always have a certain degree of error. And by that, I mean, you're scanning the word moon, and what you get is MNOON, because the M was scanned as two N's because it made an error in the conversion from this thing to an actual text. So they basically said that will not cause a problem, and they did like actual math proofs and things like that. So pretty cool stuff, OCR. But anyways, that's where I'll stop talking about OCR. But back to this stuff, the digitizing has not just really helped make a lot of content accessible to people that have a computer, but also has brought up some challenges when it comes to things like whether you can make that content searchable for stuff that's not yet in public domain. So, yes. Okay. So there's two more things to talk about, but first I am going to talk about patents and sort of the argument for and against patents, and then I'll talk about free software, and that'll be the end. So, patents. So what are patents? We already kind of briefly said. You go to the government, you say, this is my invention. You actually tell the government how your invention works in detail. They put it in their copyright office. They give you a number. That number is associated to your name. If anybody wants to use it, they can contact you for permission. Whether you want to allow them for money, for free, whatever it is, that is done through them. You, of course, have to pay the copyright office some money, not necessarily as a sort of, a burden, but more of like, because it takes money for them to store the information, and also to avoid random people just posting things, wasting the copyright office space and things like that. Or at least that's the whole idea behind them taxing you. That's what the government says. The money's for something, right? So when it comes to patents, the idea of the patent is that it's supposed to protect the inventor, by giving them essentially a monopoly over the invention for a specified period of time. And that specified period of time is when things expire and then go into the public domain. There are certain things that you can patent and some things that you cannot. For example, mathematical formulas or laws of nature cannot be patented. I can't go and patent gravity. I guess if I created an anti-gravity machine, that'd be different. But I can't just patent gravity. Obvious inventions or methods, which of course the word obvious is kind of misleading, but that's what they say, cannot be patented. So I can't patent, for example, a wheel, because that's kind of common use nowadays. I can't go and say, I'm going to go patent the wheel. Now everybody that wants to use a wheel or a tire has to pay me money. There are people that try to do this kind of thing, and they're actually known as patent trolls. And what they do is that some companies try to accumulate essentially thousands of technology patents, but actually don't make any of these products. They're just kind of throwing ideas that may not even really exist, or that they're just somebody just discovered something and they just jump in and try to patent it before the actual person that discovered did it. And the idea is that if somebody actually does come up with some technology that they sort of patented, even though they didn't really do anything and they didn't, do anything with it after they patented, the idea is that they're trying to make money over the licensing fees. So when other people want to use those patents, and this happens a lot actually. I can't really think of a lot of examples off the top of my head, but some that kind of come to me is I believe Apple had an issue with this, where they were suing somebody that patented the concept of like a touch screen, or a tap touch screen, and the people that patented probably patented like way before Apple or Android or even Palm Pros were a thing. And they, of course, are claiming money. A lot of the times, these patent trolls, they sue, they go to court, and then they typically will settle because it costs more money for the copyright holder to fight them in court than it is to just be like, okay, just stop annoying me. How much do you want? Okay, it's going to cost us like $5 million in lawyers to defend you, and we'll probably win. Okay, sure, it's going to cost you $5 million to defend it. Give me $3 million, and we'll call it a day. You save money from your lawyers, and I get some profit, which for doing really nothing, essentially, except paying some patents. And that's pretty much what happens. Another example, which kind of has to do a little bit with intellectual property, is the idea of squatters. I think that's how you spell squatters. And those are the domain squatters. You know, people that go and buy domain names on things that are copyrighted. So like, let's say I come up with this amazing company that's called Mario. Well, Mario's a generic name, but let's say Mario and Luke's Farm Incorporated, okay? And I create this company and somebody catches that and they go and they register the domain name for $10 or whatever it costs for .com. My company starts to grow and we want to make a cool website. We try to go buy the domain, but it's been taken. We can try to sue these people that say, well, you know, technically speaking, we should have this because that's the name of our company and so on. They can be like, well, I bought it, and fight it. And again, what ends up happening is they'll probably sell it to us for like $10,000, which is way better profit considering they only put in $10, right? But they probably bought about 1,000 others, you know, hoping that at least one of them kind of comes out. So those are domain squatters, and they're quite a headache, to be honest with you. I've seen them myself in person happen. Not to me directly, but some people that I know that had the company, and squatters, you know, got the name before they could and things like that. So, yeah. But anyways, so those are some examples of patents. And so going back to the idea of patenting, you know, to patent or not to patent, that is the question, right? And I think I said this before when I think I gave an example with KFC. You know, the idea of patenting is that you reward an inventor for their creative work, right? We gave a value to an idea. No longer is property just physical, but it can also be an idea. And you reward them and encourage them to keep creating more creative work by allowing them to sell their ideas to others. Furthermore, patents encourage inventors to disclose their inventions so others can build upon it. And this cannot be understated as a very, very important part of science. We can't go from A to B in one step typically. It's usually steps that get us there. You know, let's say this is Earth and this is Mars. We want to get to Mars. It's not a single hop. It's lots of little hops that build on each other to get there. And we can only do that if whenever you discover this hop, you publish it to the world so other people don't have to reinvent that piece. They don't have to reinvent the wheel for that hop. They know it's there. They can use that. They can build on top of that. That's the idea between encouraging people to disclose their inventions. Yes, they are going to want some money and so on. Sure. Worst case scenario, you wait until it goes to public domain before you make the next hop, right? But the idea is, of course, to encourage innovation and to encourage building on previous technology. On the other hand, the negative side of patents is that they can actually stifle innovation sometimes rather than encouraging it, such as when I was talking about things like domain squatters or patent trolls. You know, if you patent something that is so critical that you need to use yourself to achieve something else, you know, if you're trying to get to step 2, but you can't afford step 1, even if you reinvented step 1, if you happen to reinvent step 1 in the same way that it was already patented, or that somebody already had it, but you hadn't seen their patent, you still can't use it because it was patented by them. And so it might stifle you in that sense if you can't, if the person that actually holds the patent refuses to let you use it, even if you give them a lot of money, even if you said, here's all the money, take it. But like they're like, nope, we're not letting you use it. Then that will be an example of stifling that would happen, right? Another part is that, you know, it can be very expensive to use technology that is patented. So let's say that I have this great idea and I'm going to, you know, throw it out in the market. This really, really cool idea. I go out there. It's called it's going to be a pencil that can be used for drawing in a tablet. Okay, I had this amazing idea. I frankly didn't know that it wasn't out there. I thought I was the first one. I do it. I sell it. A year from now, I get a big lawsuit from a company that allegedly owns drawable pencils. I get Apple Pencil, so Apple sues me for that. Okay, I'm screwed at that point, and they're probably right. They all held the patent, so they're either going to take all my profits or they're just going to take all my money, and I'm going to have to shut down, right? And so a lot of companies have this fear, and so they have entire sections of a company that is made up of lawyers that research patents, you know, to avoid potentially being sued, you know, if they were to use something that is already patented. So it costs them money to basically make sure that nobody has done what is frankly you might have had the idea yourself independently, but you can never prove that. So it costs money just to basically make sure you're not breaking somebody else's copyright, which can be a pain. Furthermore, a small company that is trying to develop something, you know, can't really fight a massive company with millions of dollars in lawyers if they sue them for copyright infringement. And they might be in the right, the small company, but when you're getting sued by a huge company with pretty much unlimited amount of cash flow to their lawyers, it doesn't matter who's right or wrong. What matters is how long they can draw the court case and how much money it's going to cost you to keep going in that court case until you basically have no more money, and not lose because you're wrong, but lose because you can't afford to keep the court case going. And that's something that is not rare, but happens a lot. So there is definitely a downside to patents because it's always difficult to determine when something is truly original and distinguishable, that you can patent it, and something that is not. And so, you know, there's pros and there's cons to everything, even including patents. So I will let you make the decision on what you think about patents. But you can see as to the why some people may choose not to patent, to not have to avoid with these issues in the first place. So, yes. All right. Finally, let's talk about licenses. So, you know, there's this concept of free software. What is free software? Free software is the idea of when you're going, this is a CS class at the end of the day. And most of you have written some code, I hope. In fact, I hope all of you have written code at this point. Otherwise, I question how you got in this class, right? Because I think the requirement for this class is like 202 or something. So, yeah. But anyways, the code that you've written is no different than somebody writing a book or a poem or a song or a movie. You hold copyright to that code. Furthermore, if you were to release that code to others, you may want to release it with intentions of anybody being able to use it freely. Or you may want to hold copyright and be like, nobody's allowed to use it. So maybe you can just release it online so people can see it, but they can't compile and run it because you hold copyright. So you're like, hey, you can see my code. I am, you know, opening it up, giving you the source code, but you can't run it. And technically speaking, you have the power to do that. If you release a source code to your program just to show people that you're not doing anything sketchy, that's fine. But you can also say, you can see the code, but you can't steal it or use it. And you're in all your right to do that. Whether or not you can control somebody from copying and pasting your code, downloading it basically, compiling it, and running it and selling it without a license, it's a different story. But there could be a lot of confusion and arguments when people do that. If I release my source code and say, hey, I'm releasing my source code, you want to make sure that you are very clear as to what other people can and cannot do with that code. And so different licenses allow different things. And we're going to talk about a couple of them. The most important ones I'd say that you should know that limit, again, what you can do with that code and what you cannot do, and the derivative works that come out of that. But first, let's talk about the concept of just open source, which I hope that you've heard this term, but if not, then let me define it. So open source is software that is distributed, typically in the internet, I'd say, it's distributed or made public in source code. So you're giving out the source code. And what is source code? I mean, it's a 135 question, but that's the code that you're compiling and then, do your code. So the C++ code, that is source code, your CPP files or your Python files or your Java files. And that is typically readable and modifiable at that point. So when you say we're going to make our program up open source, you're saying that you're going to be able to distribute that. You're not quite saying yet how you're allowing people to read it, modify it, and distribute it. So it's not a license per se, but it's a concept of just releasing the code. Now, when we say free software, that idea is essentially to allow people to copy, use, and modify software. Okay? So, or I've also heard the term freeware. Freeware software, or just freeware, free software. And that is freedom of use, copy, and modifying. Not necessarily does it mean that there's a lack of cost, but typically there is. Okay? However, suppose that you want, you want to help the world be a better place. So you create this great program and you release it and you say, take it, my children. Use it as you please. I don't care. And you love the fact that it's free and you want to tell all the people in the world that it's free. And then somebody comes along and says, this is really cool. Let me go ahead and download this, put it on a CD, print the case for it, and sell it on the store for $50. And you get to people to the store that may not be aware that this came from a free project, and they actually pay money. And now somebody is profiting off of your work, which you might not care too much about, but you might not care that they're profiting more than you care that these people could have gotten it for free, but they're not. Or maybe you don't care at all. You're like, whatever, at least they got it. Maybe they would have not gotten it anyways. But perhaps you want some sort of control. And so if you want some sort of control, you have to define what that control is. And that brings us to a term that I talked about the other day, and I'll post again the link to maybe like the Wikipedia of it, which is copyleft. So what is copyleft? Copyleft is an arrangement where you are allowing people to use your work, to modify it, to distribute it. So use, modify, distribute, as long as they do these things freely as well. And on the condition that anything that they do to your software when they modify it or while they're distributing it is bound by the same condition. Now, what does that mean bound to the same condition? What that means is that if they go ahead and upgrade your code, or downgrade it, I suppose, they still have to give it away freely and allow others to modify it as well. So they can't potentially modify it and then charge for it or not release the source code. So anyways, that concept of copyleft is going to come into play as I go over the different licenses. So I'll go ahead and post a couple of links to different licenses. And so some different websites that have details of licenses, because I can't really cover all of them. So you can go ahead and take a look. But I'll go over some of the important ones. But first of all, I make sure you understand this. You are the copyright holder. If you want to change what license you're releasing some code on, you have all the absolute right to do so. Don't feel compelled that just because you release something freely and open source, that it has to always remain that way. There is a catch with that though. You own the copyright because you actually made the code. But the moment that other people contribute to the code, it's no longer just your copyright. It's also the contributor's copyright. So there it gets a little bit iffy. So that is the only catch to that. So for example, Linux, right? Linux is released essentially, under a license that everybody can use it and it can be derived. He can't all of a sudden change it and say, well, we're going to make a closed source for profit, because he will need the agreement of all of the thousands of contributors that have contributed to probably to the source code that made like the Unix systems, right? Or the Linux kernels. However, for a smaller and more reasonable project where you have a couple of people working on something that is open source, as long as you agree and all of the contributors agree, then you actually have the ability to change the licensing. And this is something that I have a personal story about. We were developing a game that was actually a modification of a game that was available, and the game was getting old, and there was less and less people supporting it. We still had some hundreds of players that were using the game, but that's not really that big of a population when you think about concurrent players. Maybe there was like 50 concurrent players at a time. So essentially we said, hey, we don't have the manpower to keep developing this, or the interest, in the sense of that there's not that many people interested. So why don't we just make it open source so that other people can contribute? We might regain interest. We might get more community feedback. Things might be better that way. And then we were like, well, this is a pretty cool idea. I mean, sure, we got to clean up the code a little bit and do a couple of things. We were kind of worried about potential hackers once you see the source code, that they could go in there and find exploits to the code. But then my argument there was like, well, sure, people will find exploits, but then other people will be compelled to help fix them by crowdsourcing that work, And so the thing that we faced was that while the development team was maybe about, 20 people active at the time, that code had gone through maybe 100 different developers before even I went in there. And so maybe not 100, that's an exaggeration, but maybe like another 50, maybe like 40 people total. Yeah. And so for us to technically release the code, unless we could find a way to remove the contributions of the really old people, which frankly, a lot of the code was rewritten more than one time. So it's possible that some of the original contributors, their code was rewritten to the point that their contributions were gone, But then again, we respected the fact that they contributed in the first place. So for us to make it open source and make things legal, we would have had to contact every single person. And some of these people work on this before the modern era of the internet. So some of them, we had AIM and MSN messengers as one of the few ways of communicating, and some emails that they might have left behind. We found a couple, but we could never find all of them. And I believe that basically we said we can't do it. We can't open source it because first of all, there's some people in the team that didn't want in the first place, and then their reasoning was that we had to find everybody, and some of the older people, the OG people, had to say yes because they were the OGs, so we have to respect what they believe, the elders per se. And yeah, we could not do it. And, you know, we have the copyright to do that, but we couldn't. And I left that team many years ago. And technically speaking, I did leave an argument saying, you know, if you guys ever want to open source it, I give my permission to do that. But if I hadn't done that, then I would be one more of those persons that they have to hunt down before they could open source it. But at least I left that behind and I said, you guys can do whatever you want with this. I don't care. Just leave my name somewhere that I was once part of this team for nostalgia reasons, if anything. So yes, it can definitely be a thing. So I recommend that if you're ever working on a team, that you make sure that you're very careful, because the moment somebody else contributes to that code, it's no longer just your code. Unless you might, if you don't have some sort of contractual agreement ahead of time, you better try to at least plan ahead for these kind of things when they come and happen. So the last thing you want is something that people are working on out of love to turn into an argument and a way to break friendships and things like that. So that's my story behind as to the why it's very important to know how licensing works, and to know that once you choose a license, yes, you can change it, but it can be tricky the more people that are involved in that. And if somebody ever leaves a project, make sure they leave definitely a way to contact them. That I learned there. Make sure you always have like a billion different ways of contacting someone then, because like, you know, they might have left like a MySpace behind, but MySpace is pretty much gone at this point. So like that would be useless. There's some of the people there we contacted to Xfire. Xfire, I don't even think it works anymore. So that's kind of gone. So yeah, MSN Messenger also gone. And emails, they had, yeah, it was interesting. Now I'm going to go and check up on those guys. Now I have flashbacks. But okay, so let's talk about the first license. So we have the GPL license. And there's a couple of variations of this. So this is the most basic one. GPL stands for General Public License. License with an S, not with a C. So this license has a strong copyleft, okay? So that's what copyleft was. This has a strong copyleft on that. It's, I would say, and people pretty much agree on the internet, it's one of the most protective free software licenses. And the core concept is the core concept of copyleft, that any derivative work has to be released under the GPL as well. So if I take some piece of code that is under a GPL license, I download it because it's open source and free. I download, I modify it. That is now known as a derivative work. So the act of me changing a single line of code, I am making a derivative of it. That derivative work has to be under the GPL license if I decide to release it. So I have to release it under the same terms. Those terms are, of course, that I can freely distribute the work. I have to open source it, so I have to release the source code. And I have to allow others to modify what I did. So my derivative, to make a second derivative from it, to use it, and to distribute it as they see fit. So I have to release the source code. So people with GPL, we'll call them the licensees, they have to release source code. I emphasize this because people don't do that all the time and it's annoying. Okay? The work can be suitable for commercial work, but you got to be careful because you will have to probably release some form of source code. Okay? Some examples of things under GPL. And by the way, the GPL is a natural license for the Free Software Foundation. Recommend you check them out. Definitely check them out. But the powerful thing about this is, again, that when you use something that is GPL, then your thing has to be GPL. So it's like you've been infected by the GPL virus, and anything you touch and you make that came from something GPL will also be GPL. So that protects to make sure that if you do something really cool, nobody can change it and make it private. They always have to keep it public so you can keep building upon it. And examples of those are MariaDB and MySQL, the very, very big databases out there. I recommend you take CS4, I believe it's 457, for learning how to use MySQL and MariaDB, which is pretty much the same thing for all intents and purposes. But big class you should all take. And Inkscape apparently also uses that. There's a couple of variations with the GPL that you can kind of read on your own. Again, I'll post a link where there's like GPL's versions 1, 2, 3, and so on. I think they're up at 3 now. But yeah, there is of course some disadvantages to using the GPL, and that's because of how protective it is that you have to kind of release something whenever you're using it. Oh, and by the way, I guess I didn't say this, but like GNU tools, which are the heart of the Linux system, that's all GPL as well. Okay, so yeah, Linux is like big stuff on GPL. But the big downside of GPL is the fact that, let's say that a library that you're using is released under GPL. And libraries are a big thing. I mean, whenever you're coding in your classes like 302 and whatnot, yeah, sure, you're coding from scratch, but whenever you're coding in the real world, you're not coding a data structure from scratch. You're not coding a linked list. You're not coding quicksort. You're calling a library that has quicksort so you can do it in a single line of code. Bam, done, right? That's what everybody does. That's okay, because the people that did the version of quicksort from the library is probably like the most efficient and worked on thing. It's amazing. And if you try to do something around that level, you would spend months on it, maybe. Who knows? I don't know how hardcore they go. They probably go into like assembly level to make sure it's as fast as possible. So you want to use libraries. But the issue with GPL and libraries is that if you use any library that is released under GPL, you're basically going to force the application using the library to also be released under GPL. So suppose that you come up with the next best amazing program. Like, we're going to say you just invented this really, really cool browser that like people love. It's super fast. It doesn't have memory leaks like Chrome. It has like a really good ad block, all these great things. And you coded everything from scratch. But there was one part where you had to sort something and you called the quicksort library that was released on the GPL. Well, guess what? If you were planning on selling that browser, tough luck. You were going to have to release the source code, and it's under GPL now, which frankly, hey, it's great for me because now I don't have to buy your browser. But maybe you actually wanted to sell it because you like wasted, not wasted, but you used 5 years of your life where you had no income. You just like dedicated your life to this browser project, and you're hoping to make some money back because now you're like in massive debt. So it's just, free code is great, but I can respect people that want to sell their code because they put their hard labor into that, and they could have been using that to make money, but instead they decided to do the software, right? So people that are making video games like on Steam, those indie games, the people like literally quit their jobs and they're working on like Meat Grinder for a year or something, and literally are like on the verge of bankruptcy because of that risk that they take. They by all means deserve to sell their games, and people that pirate those games are like the worst kind of people in the world because these guys are like literally on bankruptcy at this point, and they're risking that. So, it's different to do that from somebody like that. So, at the end of the day, it's okay for not everything to be free. But let's say that person using Meat Grinder used Quicksort again or some other library, and bam, now they have to do GPL. And if not, then they're in legal troubles potentially. So that's the limitation of GPL, that even if it's a library, you'd have to use GPL. So there's a license that kind of fixes that issue, and it is known as the LGPL license. And this is known as the Lesser General Public License. I keep running to write license with a C. I think it's maybe like British term versus like American way of writing it. But yeah, the LGPL is essentially like the GPL, but has a little bit of flexibility for the library kind of error. Because now with LGPL, if you do use a library that was using GPL, you're not forced to release your code under GPL. So The way it works is that if you take the source code that is under an LGPL library, a licensee takes it and modifies it. You can modify the work as you see fit, and then you can release it, the modified code, but you have to release again under the same license of LGPL. So if you modify the code, you still got to release it under LGPL. There's no catch there. You can't just make profit off somebody else by modifying it. You have to release the modified work under the same terms. The difference being that if you use the work, but not modify it, as you would in the case of a library function, so I call the sort function from this library, if I use that, but I don't modify it, then I don't need to release the derivative work under the same terms. Okay? So I guess I'll write this down since it's kind of important. So if I use work, but not modify, the derivative work doesn't have to be released on the same licenses. So essentially, this person that made their browser and then uses this GPL quicksort, as long as it was released under LGPL, then they're okay. If it was released under GPL, you're out of luck. If that library uses GPL, the normal GPL, GNU GPL, you have to release the derivative work. If you don't, then you're basically breaking copyright infringement. However, if they release it under LGPL, then you're okay to use it as long as you don't modify it. And if you choose to expand it, say you find a bug and you expand it, so that derivative work has to be released under LGPL as well. And it has to be LGPL. You can't just switch it to GPL. It has to be LGPL. Some examples of this is OpenOffice, GIMP, and ASpell, which is the spell checker that I believe Linux uses. I've used that in the past as well. It's just a terminal-based spell checker. So, yeah, that's pretty much all there. I mean, there's a lot more to it, but I think that's as much as I want to say about that one. So, again, I want to make sure you understand the GPL, it's open source. So, you can see the source code. It allows anybody to use it and modify it and distribute it. So, technically speaking, I can put it on a disk and distribute it out to anybody I want. Whether I'm selling it for distribution is kind of iffy copyright infringement or not. Like, you can claim that it cost you to make the disk and that's why you're selling it, or to ship it. But that's a really gray line, and frankly, I think it's a violation. But, they say that they're charging you for the printing process, not for the actual code. So it's kind of iffy. So hopefully nobody does that these days. Like I said, you can just download it from the internet. But yeah, I mean, I suppose that would be the equivalent of, like, if my cable provider charged me money for downloading a file because I went over my data limit and that file was GPL, they can still charge me for me downloading the GPL file because they're charging me for the act of downloading it, not for the actual contents. So yeah. But anyways, GPL, download, modify, use, sell, not sell, sorry, and then distribute derivative works. Everything is okay as long as the derivative work is also under GPL, which means that forever that chain will maintain that free power of, like, being free. LGPL, slightly more lenient in the sense that you can do everything you can with GPL in the sense that you can download, use, modify, distribute, and if you modify, then you have to also release it under the same license. However, if all you do is use it but not modify it, such as if you use a library function, then you can change and release it under a completely different license. And by different license, I mean like a fully copyright license where you don't allow anybody to use it unless they pay $1 million, and then you just give them not the source code, but the program itself. Okay? So that's that one. Let's see which other one I want to talk about. There's more peculiar ones, like there's the EPL license I'll briefly mention. EPL license stands for the Eclipse Public License, and for that one, it's a weaker copyleft. You know, it's suitable for commercial use. Licensees can modify work, but if they modify it, they have to release the modified work under the same license. So that's similar to GPL and LGPL. If you do modify the work, you must release the modified work in the same licenses. But if you just use the work, then just like LGPL, you don't need to release the derivative work under the same terms. So if, again, if you're just using a library, but you're not modifying it, then you can sell this all you want under stricter copyright. The difference between LGPL and EPL lies in the commercial distribution. So with LGPL, you can sell your browser and make billions of dollars and you're good to go. With EPL, there's a catch. If you make a lot of profit from distributing the software, you have to compensate the original EPL contributors from any damages caused by the commercial offering. So suppose that you do use it for the browser. I would say that doesn't mean you have to compensate them for that case, because it's just a small part of the browser. You know, but let's say that you make a library that is also for sorting, and you're using this guy's Quicksort library, but your library is for sorting, and you code a bunch of different sorts, but then for the Quicksort, you're using this guy's library. And then you sell that library to other developers. There, I could say that there is some commercial kind of damage that you're doing to them. Okay? Or furthermore, suppose that you use it in a very controversial thing, like something really bad, and you're using this library. And so now you're making this person look bad. Like maybe, you know, GTA gets a lot of negative press whenever they get a new GTA game out because of the violence and all those things, Grand Theft Auto. So suppose that it comes out that Grand Theft Auto used like heavily a certain EPL project. And now it's getting lots of negative press. Maybe there's like protesting and there's lawsuits and blah, blah, blah. They can go after the people that made the EPL and say, they're using that code, let's go after them too. So then, you know, the commercial person that released GTA has to help them out with the lawsuits and things like that. So EPL is kind of an extension of LGPL in the sense that it protects them from sort of commercial damages caused in commercial offerings and things like that. Examples of EPLs, some programming languages like Clojure. These are some strains of, you know, JUnit. So like for unit testing, Java that uses EPL and so on. Moving on, we have Mozilla public license. You know, surprise, surprise, who do you think uses that? Mozilla. But also LibreOffice uses it too. So what is the Mozilla public license? Basically, this is more about attribution than anything else, because licensees can modify the work. So they're okay with modifying. They can redistribute the derivative work under different terms. So this breaks away from GPL in the sense that now you can take somebody's code, modify it, and redistribute it under a completely different license, okay? So GPL, LGPL, and EPL, the three that we went over, If you modify the work and then just release that derivative work that's just a modification, you have to leave it on the same license. Mozilla, it does not. Mozilla allows you to essentially just take somebody's work, change it, and then do whatever you want with it in terms of copyright, sell it or whatever, I suppose. Okay? The only thing you can't do is you can't relicense it. You can't relicense the source code. And so then you might be asking, well, what are the pros of this? The pros of this is that they have to provide proper attribution. So they have to be very clear that, yes, they're selling you this thing, or they're giving it to you a closed source or whatever now, but they have to say that this came from this person. So back to our browser example, suppose that the library was released under MPL. In this case, let's say that the browser guy likes the library, it actually wants to tweak it a little bit because it's kind of more efficient if he tweaks it for his custom usage of it. He can do that now if it was released under MPL, and put it as part of his own source code, so it doesn't have to call a function outside. But he has to make sure that somewhere in there he says this came from Mr. X who did a great job with this, and I am using this and this and this. And he also has to distribute the original MPL license code along with it. So it's going to make his download bigger for the browser because it's actually going to have to release the source code that he took. So the original one. So even though he can say, this is the source code that I took and I modified it like this and this and this, it was made by Mr. X and here it is. And, the advantage of this is that it gives a lot of flexibility for anybody to do whatever they want their code, but you still get the recognition because they have to include that source code. So, GPL is nicer, but this is the one that's going to give you the more, the wider reach if that's what you're looking for. And like I said, Mozilla uses this and so does LibreOffice. So if I want to take Mozilla's code and make my own browser actually, and want to save 5 years instead of doing this person took 5 years that I was giving you the example of, I can take Mozilla's, call it like Omega browser or Omega Load browser, and then I can do that, but I have to include with that proper attributions that this is a derivative work from Mozilla, and I have to include the source code that I started with. So pretty cool though, pretty cool. Another one of those no copyleft kind of licenses that allow you to kind of just YOLO it is the Apache license. Also known as ASL too. So this one's like what they call a permissive free license. There's no copy left. So you can use this for commercial use. You can modify the work. You can redistribute it under different terms as well. You do not have to distribute the original source code along. So like, I don't need to put in random source code files that people probably won't understand if I'm releasing a program. But just like with the previous one, you have to provide proper attribution. So you gotta say where you got your source code from. So if you start out with, let's say Mozilla was released under Apache License 2. If the Mozilla was released under Apache License 2, you can modify the browser, make your Omega Load browser, but you have to say that you started out with Mozilla, but you don't have to include the Mozilla source code. So that's the big difference between Apache and Mozilla. And I think the last one that I want to talk about is the MIT license. The MIT license is basically kind of like the same as the Apache for the most part, in the sense that licensees can modify work. They can redistribute under different terms. They don't have to distribute the source code along with the derivative work. And they do have to provide, again, attribution, right? And I mean, it shouldn't be a requirement, but because you really should be doing it in the first place. If you're using somebody else's work, the least thing that you can do is thank them for it and say, hey, this person's great. He did this thing and now I can use it and make something better because of that. I couldn't have done it without him, right? You want to do that, not just because if you're appreciative, but because they deserve it too. So yeah. Oh, by the way, I didn't give you examples for Apache, but Apache, the biggest example that is released under Apache is Android. You know, with some of the exceptions being related to the Linux kernel inside of Android. But other than that, Android is all Apache. And for MIT, Node.js, jQuery, those are some big ones that people use all the time. You know, JavaScript, Node.js is like massive. And then some other things, but those are the ones that I would say people kind of recognize. So the other thing is, you don't have to release things under one single license. You can kind of link licenses together as well. Excuse me. Drink some water. So you don't have to make everything be one license. You can mix and match as long as they don't contradict themselves. But the key thing being that when you release software, you want to make sure that you choose the license that best fits what you're trying to achieve. Of course, if what you want to achieve is being able to give your code freely to everybody and have the greatest reach possible, you might want to go with something like MIT or Apache. The risk of doing that, of course, is that if you're trying to encourage others to release code openly, then this won't help much. In that case, you have to go towards the GPL side. But GPL might be a little bit too forceful with the source code stuff, and that's where LGPL is kind of like a good middle ground. So really, it's a matter of kind of deciding who your audience is and what you want them to do. At the end of the day, it's your work or the result of the group of work that the people that you work with, and you decide who and in what situation you want others to use your work. And that frankly applies not just to coding, but to anything. So with that, I conclude the video. I thank you all for watching. This intellectual property chapter was probably the biggest chapter. And as you can see, there's a lot of things, and frankly, there's a lot more that you can know. But for this video and for this class, I think that this is enough. So thank you all for watching. Until next time, have a great day.